Chapter 13. Recording number 1, Hatton. Friday, December 22nd, 1989, 8 o'clock a.m., year 3, day 128. Hatton present in light and truth. Dharma, it is most necessary that we sidestep the fun revelations to explain and give substantial evidence for having a terrible time believing old space cadets. Therefore, we have to give you once more quotes and document references. I would prefer to not do it in this journal, but the next few weeks shall be filled with the ancient oral teachings, and the public must have more of this information. There are other excellent resources, but we need to continue to build our credibility. Further, documents keep coming forth which are for the most part factual, but in total are not. You ones must be given that which is truth and guided a bit farther regarding that which is not. You will hone your discernment abilities quickly as you gain insight into the whole blueprint. The dilemma of evil. It is important for you ones to know what is going on about you, and further why the workers of the evil coalition must work so hard at winning. Those energy forms from the higher dimensions who have been placed on your planet cannot move into higher dimensional existence without throwing off the evil. They are simply not allowed in the universal realms. They are dense, low-frequency beings who cannot survive the high-frequency vibrations of a higher dimension. In other words, they are isolated and bound to a third or lower dimension. Oh yes, they can have invisible energy form, but they cannot bear the compression of high frequency. The desire, therefore, is to pull as many soul energies into density as possible, gain control of the planet politically and economically, and kill off the overpopulation, free up lands and resources, hopefully to maintain enough balance to prevent the pole shifting. The backup plan, for they do not expect the above plan to be successful, is to have a placement prepared in a third dimensionally secure place to ride out the period of time of earth shift. You ones are given a most beauteous place upon which to function, experience, and clean up your souls. Most have flunked the course. The alternative place for the dense energies to be placed are most hard indeed. Souls do not perish, you know, and a low-density energy form has only extremely horrendous places to be kept. Not all dense souls are evil. Most are simply ignorant and hold on to false leaders. The results remain about the same either way. Our effort is to point out the truth so that you ones can see the negative blueprint and make some informed choices. I do tell you now that it is not like your ordinary indoctrinated Bible teachers will tell you, with one major exception. If you do not come into the path of light and truth, you will have made your choice to remain in the heavy density, at which point, when the changing upheaval comes, your physical house will be in perishment. The lower astral planes are most heinous indeed, and thus do we work to raise your insight and knowledge of the way it is and not the way your leaders tell you it is. You can see all about you. That is not the way they tell you it is. Now we of these higher realms will only provide truth. No force shall be applied, for force is not of God. You each shall have to be in individual deciding. I shall again be utilizing data already brought forth from both our books and bits and pieces from myriads of other journals, periodicals, and publications. This will be quite strictly documented for your research. Dharma, bear with me, Chela, for I know it is difficult for you to work in blindness as to that which I give unto you. I shall, however, also give you the places to check that you might later come into your own comfort. Yes, precious, I am here in light, in your space is clear. Our same old friends are monitoring the work, but truth is truth, and your surveillance personnel need the truth also. As I have told you our very best workers today are prior surveillance personnel who monitored our centers. Most people do not want to be people of the lie, but they have followed most blindly that which has been told unto them. Allies and co-workers. The most outrageous outcry to Hatton is, Russia and the U.S. have not been allies. Yes, you have, and yes, you are. It is for the purpose of the world control. Oh, I hate to have to be the one to bring this stark realization into you. I drew the short straw again. I would just refer you once to other references, but I fear most of you will not obtain the information if we do not place a vid herein. Now, I'm going to take some information verbatim from information that comes forth on a printed separate page with the book, The Plan. Forgive me, brothers, for using your material, but it is exceptional and must be shared with as many as we can reach. Is the Soviet Empire collapsing? Are glasnost and perestroika for real? Don't believe it. We vigorously resist the media-generated mindset that Soviet Communist Party thugs, those very same maniacs who slaughtered over 1 million people in Afghanistan and sent 5 million more fleeing to refugee camps, are now suddenly kindly reformers willing to yield power to the downtrodden masses. The seemingly cataclysmic events taking place in Soviet bloc nations are part of a carefully planned public relations scam. The communist machine is only changing party names and changing faces for aesthetics. As the New York Times admits, the communists in Poland, for instance, retain a strangle grip on the army and the police, the principal tools of social control, and over the national television and radio, the principal instruments in its propaganda. And when the dust of Soviet reform finally settles, the world will inevitably discover that the communist totalitarian machine still holds absolute power in the USSR and in its satellite nations. All economic and political activity will be controlled by the Reds and their secret police apparatus. All propaganda outlets and all wealth will be controlled by the Reds, and all weapons will remain in the hands of the Reds. Soviet Communist Party head Mikhail Gorbachev purports to be Mr. Nice Guy, yet the Pentagon tells us that in 1989, in direct violation of his recent pledges, he directed over $1 billion in military aid to the Nicaraguan communists. Secretary of State James Baker admits that the Soviets are now actively arming the murderous communist rebels in El Salvador. Congressman Bill McCollum, Republican of Florida, reports that the Soviets are behind round-the-clock bombing in Afghanistan, where the Soviet puppet government is destroying all remnants of Afghan resistance there. The American Psychiatric Association recently found that Soviet mental institutions still incarcerate political prisoners, and it has been verified that patients are still being crucified with pain-causing psychotropic drugs used for behavior modification. And according to recent AP reports, the Soviet police still beat protesters with truncheons. The only thing that has changed about the Soviets is their store-bought image. To those who have studied the plan, it is blatantly obvious that the glasnost scam was developed to augment the impending merger of all nations under a global socialist governing authority. And according to the U.S. government documents, this all-powerful global authority is slated to be backed by a military machine which controls all the world's conventional and nuclear weapons. Glasnost is a strategic political vehicle used to condition Americans to accept unilateral disarmament of the USA. Headlines are screeching that international tensions are decreasing, and the U.S. faces dramatic military cutbacks. Such drastic military cutbacks preface the U.S. government's published plan to surrender all U.S. weapons to the United Nations military apparatus, which by international agreement is operated at the top by the Soviets. America is being set up for literal suicide. Of great importance, Glasnost provides rationale for channeling billions of American dollars to red governments, including communist Nicaragua, which just raked in several millions in election funds. Compliments of George Bush. Without this emergency funding, the despised and rotting communist machine would collapse. In keeping with the declaration of Joseph Stalin that the rich nations of the world must be harnessed to provide real and prolonged aid to communist nations. Sugar Daddy George and the Congress have just pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to Hungary and Poland. This money was pledged, no questions asked, despite the fact that these Warsaw Pact nations are an important part of the Soviet military machine, which now more than ever threatens America's existence. Haton, and despite the fact that the debt already owed by those countries to you taxpayers is positively staggering. U.S. economic aid will enable the Soviets to continue financing terrorism and bloody revolution worldwide. And this aid will also enable the Soviets to pay interest to the Western bankers who back communist governments with massive loans. And while Bush hands out money in wads, America's national debt increases by $8,000 per every second of every hour of every day. The major portion of this debt is owed to the same Soviet-loving bankers who, through their privately owned Federal Reserve System, hold federal government bonds, IOUs, on which this debt must be paid. Counting unfunded liabilities, America is over $13 trillion in debt. Because this utterly impossible debt is unsurpassing the total wealth of the nation. America is absolute bankrupt. Undaunted, the Bush regime pledges the fruits of the labor of future generations to keep the red military machine solvent today. The authors hope that you will take the time to study the master plan as outlined by the master planners themselves, and that after doing so, you will share this important information with anyone who will listen. Unless we can warn enough people in time, this nation will surely be doomed to endure the hideous ramifications of the plan. One world merger. Vladimir Lenin, the first dictator of Soviet Russia, said, "The aim of socialism is not only to bring the nations closer to each other, but also to merge them." Well, let's begin with your educational system. In 1985, America's public education system was officially merged with the propaganda apparatus of the Soviet Union. By agreement between the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the communists of the Kremlin are helping to restructure American education from the third grade up. There is an agreement of some 40 to 50 pages negotiated by the U.S. State Department, and the Soviets now provide American students with computer curricula, textbooks, films, and visiting instructors authorized to conduct experiments in American schools and colleges. This agreement is to be renewed and upgraded at frequent intervals. Let me tell you a little story which came out of Congressional Committee hearing which attempted to investigate America's largest and most powerful tax-exempt foundations. Let me tell you a little story which came out of Congressional Committee hearing which attempted to investigate America's largest and most powerful tax-exempt foundations. Testimony of Norman Dodd, research director of the above-named committee, who was invited to meet with President Roman Gaither of the Ford Foundation in 1953 in New York, was met with the following: "Mr. Dodd, we invited you to come because we thought that perhaps off the record you would be kind enough to tell us why the Congress is interested in the operations of foundations such as ourselves. We operate here under directives which emanate from the White House. The substance of the directives under which we operate is that we shall use our grant-making power to alter life in the U.S. so that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Mr. Dodd was shocked and replied, "Mr. Gaither, I do not think you are entitled to withhold this information from the American people, to whom you are beholding for your tax exemption. So why do you not tell the American people what you have just told me?" His answer was, "Mr. Dodd, we would not think of doing that. P.S. The powers behind the Ford Foundation control over $2.5 billion in tax-free assets. Ford is one of the largest private foundations in the world." More pillow agreements. The U.S.-USSR Trade and Economic Council, the New York-based organization, published an ad in the fall of 1985 in the Journal of the U.S.-USSR Trade Economic Council. You nice Americans were never intended to see it. The journal is published in the U.S. for distribution within the Soviet Union only. Now, this advertisement is for ADM, Archer Daniels Midland Company, Decatur, Illinois, 62525 USA. It projects a map of the U.S. and Russia joined at the borders, with only Decatur and Moscow identified. The substance of the material reads as follows. This map is far from accurate, but it does serve to illustrate a very important point. As trade between the USSR and U.S. expands, we're growing closer and closer together. And that's especially true when it comes to food, feed, and other agricultural products. Those who trade with the Archer Daniels Midland Company are linked directly to America's largest source of processed agricultural products. They also have access to tremendous amounts of corn, wheat, soybean, and other grains, plus the wealth of technical knowledge of ADM has acquired over the years. So even though we're 5,000 miles apart, when you trade with ADM, the distances seems to disappear. Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, is a $1 billion Illinois-based agribusiness which sells cheap grain to the Soviets, although it takes in hundreds of millions of dollars in federal subsidies for its lucrative gasohol program. ADM head is Dwayne Andreas, dubbed by Newsweek magazine as one of Gorbachev's prairie pals. Andreas, who owns $230 million in ADM stock, makes large contributions to America's senators and congressmen. In 1988, Andreas spoke at a Trade and Economic Council meeting in Moscow. He assured his Soviet pals that there is little difference between the United States and the Soviet Union these days, he said. While the Soviets are adopting capitalist market economy devices to make Lenin's socialism work better, we, over the past 40 years, have adopted many socialist devices intended to make capitalism work better. In the West, state ownership of major enterprises is long established, and where government does not own business institutions, it is their effective partner through tax and trade credit policies. So we're not as far apart as many people think. Andreas is a co-chairman of the U.S.-USSR Trade and Economic Council. He also made a bid to buy the KGB-bugged U.S. Embassy building in Moscow in 1989. And the council is staffed by 30 Soviet directors. The council is riddled with Soviet espionage agents, including the notorious General Yevgeny Pitovranov. You try saying these words. Stalin's favorite protege. Pitovranov has been identified by U.S. intelligence as the leading KGB operative in charge of acquiring U.S. technical data. Now, Pitovranov is the council's governing board. The council continually interviews U.S. businessmen in quest of technology for the Soviet military machine. Thus, America's leading corporate capitalists and the dreaded Soviet KGB are not as far apart as people might think. one U.S. Senator says of the Trade and Economic Council. The Council is quite simply an arm of the Soviet government under KGB control, whose purpose is to subvert the U.S. economy. The communists have always believed in war on all fronts: military, diplomatic, social, and economic. The Council is an instrument of subversion. Senator Jesse Helms. In 1985, Malcolm Baldrige, who was then U.S. Commerce Secretary, confirmed that the cozy partnership between corporate America and the Soviet KGB has been arranged by the U.S. government. Baldrige told the Soviets at a council meeting, "I am pleased to be here tonight to lend my support and the support of the United States government to the work of the U.S.-USSR Trade and Economic Council. More than 10 years ago, the Department of Commerce helped establish the council, and events since then have shown this was a wise decision." Oh, and then good old boy Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, listed a number of these earth-shaking events when he admitted Soviet behavior in recent years has given the lie to the argument that trade and credits by themselves will bring about benign evolution of the Soviet system. Soviet-Cuban intervention in Angola, in Ethiopia, and in South Yemen, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the suppression of solidarity in Poland, and the use of toxic chemical and biological warfare in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia have all occurred in precisely the period of expanded East-West economic cooperation. I want to point out here that there are more than 300 U.S. corporations who are members of this council, and more joining daily, some of which you of my crew would recognize. Further, I make no judgment on the applicability of such interchange. I simply point out that U.S. citizens are not informed. If anyone listened to that which President Bush told you yesterday at the end of his press conference, you would understand how really serious is your situation. He said that he kept secrets from the public and would most certainly continue to do so as long as he is president. And if you don't like it, you can vote him out of office next election. Yes, I'm sure Mr. LaRouche is proof of how easy it is to get a pre-selected candidate out of being elected, and what happens to the ones who try. Mr. LaRouche's campaign secretary, Michael Billington, was sentenced to 77 years in prison for political fundraising. This young lady and 16 other LaRouche associates were railroaded. Dear friends, you are in such drastic circumstance, and you seem to not realize of it. This man did everything in his power to tell you how it is, and you allowed this to happen to him. Of course, he is not perfection. Is Mr. Bush perfection? Further, yesterday Mr. Bush told you between the lines that business was never interrupted with China and that he gives ultimate credit to Mr. Kissinger. Open your eyes and ears. The grain conveyor belt. Grain is vital to the Soviet military machine. Grain imports from the West allow the Soviets to concentrate their resources on military hardware and on war and revolution throughout the world. Without grain imports, Soviet militarism and imperialism would fail. Viktor Suvorov, an important defector from the Soviet military intelligence apparatus GRU, reports, socialism, for all its gigantic resources, is not capable of feeding itself. How easy it would be to place an embargo on the supply of bread to the Soviet Union until Soviet forces no longer found themselves in occupied Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, until such time as the Cubans no longer held sway in Africa, until the Berlin Wall disappeared. It would only be necessary to withhold supplies of grain for a few months, and the whole edifice of socialism might fall to pieces. Well now, you can simply send your grain directly to these places along with the tab for their freedom building. The full weight and authority of the U.S. government is directed towards providing ample grain for the Soviets. Since the 1960s, the U.S. has avalanched the USSR with cheap grain. The Congressional Research Service reports. The 1972 grain sales were characterized in the U.S. press as the Great Russian Grain Robbery, because of the tactic of minimizing public information about the size and suddenness of Soviet purchases resulted in lower prices than would otherwise have been obtained. Farmers complained that they would not have sold their grain as early or as cheaply had they known of Soviet intentions. Consumers complained about high food prices that resulted from the large drawdown in grain stock. In 1983, the U.S. agreed to provide millions of metric tons of grains to the Soviets for each of 5 years. Yet, during the 5 years this agreement was in force, hundreds of thousands of small U.S. farmers declared bankruptcy. The U.S. agriculture is heavily subsidized by the federal government. Each tax-paying family in America contributes $700 in taxes annually to support federal farm subsidies. Taxpayers also subsidize the U.S. Commodity Credit Corporation, which extends credit to the Soviets for their grain purchases. Taxpayers provide huge federal export subsidies to large U.S. corporations for making grain available to the Reds at discount. Under the Department of Agriculture's Export Enhancement Program, the Soviets buy U.S. grain for less than it costs to produce. In late 1988, the U.S. awarded the Soviets a new 2-year grain contract. This particular swindle will cost American taxpayers an estimated $46.2 million. And one news source reported, but no one seems able to account for how the Russians pay for their grain imports. In Washington, the question whether and how the Russians pay is considered to be privileged information. If these transactions were normal business deals, then surely the answer to the questions, on what terms are they conducted, would not be considered a matter of privilege. It is certain that the United States does not receive any direct payment for these transactions. And despite huge federal deficits, politicians never suggest that the Soviets should pay full market value for their grain. We conclude that the U.S. government is desperately anxious to feed the Soviet military machine. In order to do so, the U.S. government is ripping off the taxpayers and the small farmers of America. Why? Because, as Sovorov testifies, the means of producing bread is the Achilles heel of socialism. Strike at it, socialism will fall to pieces. All invasion, nationalization, and collectivization will cease. You might now ask, well, Hatton, what does this have to do with Revelation prophecies and the decay of a planet and the rising of the phoenix? So be it. Ponder your own questions most carefully. It has everything to do with it all. Read the other Phoenix journals. Look at what is happening to your world while your string pullers feed you puppets with sugar water, drugs, and distractions. Americans must understand that the U.S. government will never permit Soviet socialism to fall into pieces, because socialism is the heart and soul of the overall plan for the world control. Then it automatically falls into the few gray men who control the purse strings. Financial roots of power. Since this portion is basically regarding the Russians, I shall only sidetrack to point out a few parallel facts. The U.S. has basically provided for the founding of Israel. Well, the U.S. financed the Bolshevik Revolution, financed and directed it right from the U.S. That was in 1917, and it has never changed. President Woodrow Wilson contributed $20 million to the Bolshevik cause from the special war fund set aside by Congress for World War I. Wall Street financier Jacob Schiff, financially aligned with the world's wealthiest families, including Rothschilds, the Harrimans, the Rockefellers. Wall Street financier Jacob Schiff, financially aligned with the world's wealthiest families, including the Rothschilds, the Harrimans, and the Rockefellers. Remember who these people are and where they fit into the gray men structure. Contributed at least $20 million to the revolution. Back in those good old days, $20 million was a very great deal of money. The international financier J.P. Morgan, who by the turn of the century wielded monopoly control of banking and industry in the U.S., donated $1 million personally to the communists in Russia. Britisher Lord Alfred Milner, representing the core of political economic power in Europe, was personally in Russia during the revolution to assist the Bolsheviks in obtaining weapons. Milner contributed a reported 21 million rubles to the Marxist cause. American businessmen and government officials provided diplomatic and financial assistance to V.I. Lenin and his Bolshevik revolutionaries through these corporate entities. The American International Corporation, J.P. Morgan, W.A. Harriman Company, Harriman Family, Chase National Bank, Chase Manhattan, Rockefeller Morgan, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, privately owned. Federal Reserve Board controls the U.S. banking and credit. Guarantee Trust Company, Harriman, J.P. Morgan, the National City Bank, Rockefeller. By golly, I want all of you to pay attention because I want everyone reading this to take note that J.P. Morgan was the ultimate destruction of Nikola Tesla. Sometimes God gets angry. Lenin seized gold in purest gangster style by armed parties, not unlike your own circumstance some time back. He took it from Russia banks and from Russian citizens. He used this stolen gold to create Roscombank, the first official Soviet central bank. J.P. Morgan's Wall Street firm Guarantee Trust Company became Lenin's fiscal agent in the U.S. Guarantee Trust. Still today, at the apex of U.S. corporate power, operate the foreign branch of Lenin's Roscombank. Now watch the sleight of hand and exchange tactics. Immediately after the revolution, Lenin placed large deposits of gold with Guarantee Trust and with other U.S. banks owned by American capitalists who had financed the Bolshevik Revolution. And Lenin also handed his wealthy mentors monopoly concessions on oil, minerals, and other raw materials in Russia. Lenin's terrorist police, Cheka, consolidated totalitarian power in Russia by pulling the skin off the bones of their victims' hands like a glove, rolling naked people in spiked barrels and putting others into coffins, decomposing corpses, applying red-hot five-pointed stars to the foreheads and crowning priests with wreaths of barbed wire, amputating limbs with saws, crucifying, scalping, dismembering, and roasting alive the proletariat. Now, would you say that these ones sound like good old Satanists? They certainly do to me. Meanwhile, back at the U.S. ranch, Mr. Wilson and other U.S. officials were providing Lenin with weapons and secret military assistance. The Rockefeller family, having made a deal with Lenin to buy oil-rich property in the Caucasus, arranged for the Bolsheviks a loan of $750 million. Communist tyranny was well funded. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, deliberately starved to death 9 million Ukrainian peasants and condemned tens of millions of political prisoners to confinement and torture in death camps. Meantime, American firms including DuPont, Ingersoll Rand, IBM, Westinghouse, U.S. Steel Corporation, U.S. Rubber, General Electric, Guarantee Trust, New York Life, International Harvester, and Vacuum Oil provided the financial and industrial foundations of Stalin's power. Stalin's genocidal regime was merely a front for a megalithic Wall Street syndicate which included Jacob Schiff's Kuhn-Loeb Company of New York. Kuhn-Loeb financed Stalin's first 5-year plan. Are any of you readers getting mad yet? You should be mad as hell and unwilling to take it anymore. Today, the Soviets, the Communist Chinese, and all their puppet minions are completely dependent for military and industrial development upon the world's most powerful corporate capitalists. These wealthy businessmen have created an international network of banks and government agencies which undergird communist power by providing credit, bank bailouts, and below-market loans, many of which are guaranteed by American and European taxpayers. This financial network is an umbilical cord through which Western capitalists nourish their avaricious red fetus. The umbilical cord includes World Bank, International Development Agency, United Nations, International Monetary Fund, United Nations, Bank of International Settlement, Swiss, Apex of Network, U.S. Export-Import Bank, loans guaranteed by U.S. taxpayers, Chase Manhattan Bank, Bank of America, Irvine Trust Company, Manufacturers, Hanover Chemical Bank, Lazard Brothers, and hundreds of other U.S., Canadian, and European banks. Does it now make sense to you why there was no interruption in the business with China and why there are multitudes of private meetings which you will never hear about? Further, I am telling you in enough ways and enough times to cause you to take notice that this is truth. Check it all for yourselves. At the end of this journal, I shall tell you where you can get all the references for proof. I honor the ones who have researched and brought forth documents and proof of these heinous activities. You are a blessed and holy land, and you have been corrupted in the most terrible manner. This is a blatant sign of the times of the revelation. You need no more deciphering of the old prophecies. You need to function in those that have now come to be in your present. The Soviets and their puppet governments throughout the world owe Western banks and governments over $130 billion. This debt increases by at least $2 billion per month. If the communists pulled a calculated default, they would collapse the global monetary system. So they blackmail the West into new below-market loans, which cost the lenders, which are the U.S. taxpayers, very large sums of money indeed. Oh, it is part of the plan, but you as citizens do not know it. And the guillotine is not yet planned to crash down on you, but very, very soon it is. In 1988, the Soviets, nudged on by their capitalist partners, boldly demanded revision of existing limits on export-import bank guarantees for loans to the Soviet Union. This would allow the Soviets unlimited guarantees that if they default on their payments to large U.S. corporations for purchase of goods and services, the U.S. taxpayers will step in and pay the debt. David Rockefeller is scion on one of the Wall Street families which originally sponsored the Soviet experiment. The Rockefeller family is worth at least $2 billion. As chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, David Rockefeller addressed a Trade and Economic Council meeting in Moscow in 1987. He said, as early as 1924, accounts for both the Bank for Foreign Trade of the USSR and the State Bank of the USSR were opened at the Chase Bank in agreement to help finance the Kama River Truck Foundry, the largest in the world. Kama later manufactured assault vehicles used for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We were also privileged in 1973 to open our representative office in Moscow. Over the past several decades, we have witnessed many ups and downs in relations between our two countries. Through it all, those who are primarily concerned with commerce finance, and industry have sought to maintain economic ties that are mutually rewarding. Sovietologist Richard Pipes of Harvard, a former director of East European and Soviet Affairs, National Security Council, explains the capitalist-communist partnership. The most unabashed voice in the West favoring accommodation with the Soviet Union belongs to the business community. On the face of it, pro-Soviet sympathies on the part of a group that the Soviet Union is committed to destroying may seem absurd, but it is fact that only serves to emphasize the elitist character of the Soviet leadership and the affinities that elites feel for each other, notwithstanding ideological or national differences. The workers of all countries have never united as effectively as have their ruling elites, which constitute the only true international. World-renowned historian Dr. Anthony C. Sutton agrees. One of the most pervasive but downright erroneous themes in modern textbook history is that of a competition between capitalist and Marxist systems. In fact, given objective examination of all facts, nothing could be further from the truth. The two political power groups cooperate with each other, nurture each other, and in general are jointly responsible for much of the pain and suffering of the average man on the street in this world. Much of the confusion stems from an unwillingness to define monopoly capitalism for what it is, a political power system that is much like state socialism. Thus, a Brezhnev or Gorbachev or a Rockefeller have much in common. Both are monopolists, and both thrive on the use of political power to retain their monopoly. Brothers, megacorporations have no problem operating within totalitarian nations. Totalitarianism provides mega-capitalists with two commodities they love most: maximum profits and zero competition. The little Russian brother on the street is actually in the very same predicament as are you. Let me just outline the deal briefly. The Soviets help the capitalists maximize profits, and the capitalists help the Soviets maintain totalitarian dictatorship. Is it any wonder that Mr. Bush was not elated and hopping up and down in glee when the Berlin Wall became overwhelmed and crashed down? You had not done your job well enough, and Mr. Bush is the big cheese honcho of this deal. Dharma, let us have a break for rest, and then we shall cover the deal. I am sorry to give you all this mass work, but it must be done, Chela, and my appreciation is very unlimited. I now move to standby. Please summon me when you're ready to continue. Haton 2 out, please. And then he provides address for copies of the plan. You can go to Independent Research Associates, BOS, 2013 Hayden, Idaho, 83835.